So this challenge of getting younger supervisors to manage older workers is a big one. It's only going to grow as the workforce begins to age. It's going to be much more common to have somebody younger than you are supervise you. And it probably helps, before we get specific, to just remind ourselves of what the problem is. The problem starts mainly with the supervisors who are younger and feel that they can't manage people who are older than they are because they don't know how. Those folks have more expertise. They think of them as their parents. They get intimidated sometimes, and sometimes they don't give them feedback actually when they should. So thinking about how to manage them begins with how to engage and hire them in the first place, and that is what is attractive to older workers in this context. And a lot of that has to do with more meaning to work, right? To actually create a context where they're working on tasks and problems where they can see connection to outcomes, and particularly to social outcomes. We know that empowers everybody. We know it leads to better performance, but especially for people who are at their end of their careers. They're less interested in money. They're more interested in social contact, and they're more interested in doing things that really matter. So creating a description of the work and defining it in such a way that older workers maybe could specifically focus on those tasks that have greater social impact. That's a way to begin. I think when it comes down to actually managing them, the process of engaging older workers is one that we see maybe best modeled in the military actually now, and especially in the Marine Corps, where they've got a formal model where young lieutenants who come in right out of officer training are paired up with experienced sergeants who are often a generation older than they are. And they're taught and told that they actually have to work together. So the lieutenant manages the relationships with the brass above. The sergeant provides a lot of context and a lot of information. They collaborate. They make decisions jointly. The lieutenant is actually in charge, but the sergeant is a resource that you absolutely can't avoid and you have to work with, and the sergeant actually kind of communicates what's going on. So I'd say maybe with older workers, it's not a bad idea to do this with all workers, but with older workers, the best thing to do is to sit down with them in advance of decisions, important decisions that affect them, and say, here's the problem, here's what I've been tasked to do, here's what it looks like we need you to do. Let's talk about this, let's talk about how to get it done. So think about that arrangement between the lieutenant and the sergeant. The same sort of thing applies, I think, in the workplace. I think particularly older workers expect you to acknowledge their expertise. So it doesn't hurt to just say a few times, I know you've been doing this longer than I have, and you probably have thoughts on how best to do it. I think it's also important, in addition to engaging them, to think about giving them feedback. Sometimes we're reluctant to do that because we figure they must know what they're doing, or they're older and, geez, I don't want to give them feedback. But it is important to give them feedback. Maybe the way is a little different. It reflects more on what you see happening and maybe a little less judgmental. That is, you're not rushing as quickly to solutions as you might with somebody just beginning. You might say, well, I saw this report come back from you, or I saw this engagement here, and here's what it looked to me like was going on or what happened. What do you think? What should we do about this? So delay the process of offering solutions a bit and help give them an opportunity to explain what's going on and to think about how to do things differently. So I think both in the setting up of tasks and in the feedback about tasks, a sort of performance review, things have to be a little different, even for the immediate supervisor. But it is important to give feedback. You're still in charge. And it is important to engage them in the same sort of way you might try to engage everybody. So examples of companies that do this stuff poorly are sort of legion, and I think the poor way is basically just to not pay any attention to what your managers are doing at the lower levels. They're hiring, they're making supervisory decisions, and they've often just loaded up their own biases in this process, and so they do things poorly. So it doesn't take much to do this badly. Basically, it means just leave your managers alone and bad things will happen as a result of this. So the companies that manage this process well, first, they manage it well on the recruiting side. So the AARP, for example, has got a website with a job board, job recruiting, that certifies companies as being older worker friendly, and that is companies that in their advertising make it clear that they're not discriminating, that they're open to everybody, older workers as well, that they offer maybe some of the cafeteria-style benefits that are more attractive to older workers, like elder care in addition to child care, sorts of things, and more advice on retirement. Issues around work scheduling, more flexibility, so older workers who often have more family responsibilities, or at least more interest in demands outside of work, can better accommodate them. So some of it is on the recruiting side. The companies that do this well in terms of accommodating the special needs are companies like Draper Labs, for example, which is a company that accommodates his workers that are about to retire and basically says, we'll give you more autonomy, we're maybe not paying you quite as much, to work on your own schedule. Deloitte is a company that does something similar with its soon-to-be retired workers or people who would otherwise leave early, and says, look, we'll let you pick some of the projects you want to work on because we figure at this point you have the judgment to know what is going to work for you. There's a bunch of healthcare companies, Bon Secours among them, that's been particularly good at benefits for employees, trying to get nurses to stay longer, more tuition-based reimbursement for people who would like to change their careers as they get a little older or maybe upgrade their skills along the way. So we see more of that sort of stuff in terms of benefits among companies that are trying to engage their more experienced workers. There are other companies that have gotten particularly good at finding ways to re-engage people who've already retired. Procter & Gamble and Eli Lilly together put together a program for encore careers for employees who've retired to come back as consultants. You can think of it sort of as like a big temp agency for special projects where they re-engage and bring back some of their long-term employees for special projects, special assignments, consulting-like arrangements. Dow Chemical, and other companies have done this as well, have relied on some of their social networking software as a way to keep older employees engaged with each other, even sometimes retired employees. Some of this is information sharing. So that younger employees can ask questions of the retired employees who perhaps have seen something or some client arrangement or something years ago and get the history on it and get some of the backgrounds. Edward Jones, the brokerage company, does something quite interesting with its retired employees, and that is it brings them back to socialize the incoming employees. So the very oldest and the retired employees teach the incoming employees what the company is like. They tell stories about the history of the place, what it meant to them, how the culture of the company operates. It's a way to maintain some consistency in culture as well. Why employers don't seem to be paying more attention to this issue is a really interesting problem because, we see reading the business press that they seem to be falling all over themselves to pay attention to Generation Y and Generation X and Z and all the the new categories that come up for each new cohort entering the workforce, when in fact the older worker group is a much bigger cohort, and it's going to be here forever, and their needs are, pretty similar and pretty common. So you don't have to keep adjusting for each little cohort sorts of things. So it makes perfect sense to do it. Why they're not is an interesting problem. And I think a lot of it comes down to being stuck first in a model of careers which is already out of date, but it's still in the back of people's minds. And that's the idea that people will come, you'll develop them, they'll stay with you for a lifetime. That hasn't been true for a while, but a remarkable number of people, particularly at the top of organizations, still think that's the way things should be, even though it's probably not even true for themselves or their own career. That's the model they've sort of got in mind. So they're focused on the young people because of that, and some of it is just the buzz. There's been so much business discussion about young workers, and I think there's a focus on that for a reason. A lot of it is just misunderstandings. There's a sense that younger workers are cheaper and more effective. There's no evidence for that. In fact, all the evidence is the opposite, that actually older workers are more effective. But a lot of it has to do simply with the fact that the problems we're talking about are rooted in the behavior and the attitudes of managers, particularly those of middle age, and often the younger ones as well. And this is much like the problems we saw a generation or so ago with discrimination with respect to gender and race. And that is, it's not company policies that discriminate or that make it difficult to engage, in the past, women and minorities. It was the mental models in people's heads and the practices of individual supervisors. There was never anything written down that said don't hire women or don't promote them. It just happened. And so unless companies actively do something to address these problems, they're going to persist because they are fundamentally in the minds of the managers, and particularly the first-line supervisors.